Hey guys, welcome to the Dude Real Estate Show. I'm here with Billy again. Billy, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Another week goes by, and I'm excited to dive in today.
Yeah, cool. So today we are going to talk about the importance of your first real estate deal. And one thing I kind of like to say, I've said this before, so maybe some people have heard this, but uh, a lot of people want to invest in real estate, uh, and 100% of people who don't get their first real estate deal never get their second real estate deal. So let that sink in for a minute, right? So sometimes you see people that might have like one rental property, and usually those are what we call accidental landlords. They bought a house or a condo, and then maybe they started a family, or they needed a bigger place, or they had to move for their job, and for whatever reason they couldn't sell it or didn't want to sell it. Maybe they're a little bit underwater on the mortgage, something like that. So they hold on to it as a rental property, but they don't want to be landlords necessarily. Um, so a lot of cases, as soon as they can dump the property, they do, and they don't ever buy real estate as an investment again. But people who do want to buy rental properties and invest in real estate, they almost never stop at one. I have yet to see someone who stops with just one rental property. But this is why it's really important to get that first deal, because you can't get that second deal without having that first one. So you get a ton of experience. You learn a lot from your first deal. So I guess first we'll just start out with just a story about my first deal. Um, Me and a buddy partnered up. We had the itch to invest. This was back in 2016, I want to say, maybe. It was so long ago. I don't even remember anymore. Maybe it was earlier. Might have been 2014 actually. It was an even year. And we pooled our funds. We lined up some financing as well, and we were kind of on the hunt for a property. At the time, there were still some foreclosures to be had in our area, and so there was a foreclosure that was just a couple miles from me. Single family home. I think it was a 3 bed, 2 bath, or 3 bed, 1.5 bath, about 1,400 square feet, right by the high school. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was there was wallpaper on the ceilings, wallpaper on the kitchen cabinets. I mean, it was like straight out of the 70s and hadn't been touched. So it was pretty bad. And I forget what it was listed at, but it was technically an auction property. And so even though I was an agent at the time, I pretty much had zero experience with auction properties. So I really didn't even know what to expect. And to back up just a little bit, I didn't even feel comfortable until that point to pull a trigger on a deal, even though I think I had roughly 60 real estate transactions under my belt, helping other clients buy and sell properties. At least at that point, I felt like I had a comfort level with the transaction. So I felt at least that part I know. But then when it came to things like actually me buying the property, using an LLC, partnering up with someone, figuring out the financing angle. And then the big thing that we'll talk about a little bit later is, vetting contractors and that whole thing, which is very challenging. So we did, we bid on it. It was an online auction. We didn't get it at the online auction, and no one got it. And so they actually went to a live auction. So we headed to Chicago for a live auction, and we were both really nervous. We didn't know, like, um, we were like in the car and we're like, okay, so what's our strategy here? Like, what's the highest we can go comfortably without shooting ourselves in the foot on our first deal? Um, so we kind of tried to put a strategy together, and we got there, and it was not a big room. There was maybe a dozen properties being auctioned off, and as the auction went on, ours was like the last property that they were auctioning off. And the bad news was no one was bidding on these other properties that were at the auction. So we're like, oh boy. So that means everyone is here for the house we want to bid on as well. And that was the case. So there were several other people that were bidding against us, but we kind of stuck to our guns, and we had a price in mind. And for us, it was going to be a rental property. I think the reason we got it is I think the other people in the room were flippers. And so they had a little less margin there where they have to get it for a certain price because they got to flip it quick. Whereas we can actually make back a little more money in the long run. And so we're willing to pay a slightly higher price for a rental property as opposed to a flip. So we did end up getting it, closed on it a few weeks later. We bought it for 62,000 and we ended up putting about 62,000 into it. And it appraised for 150,000. And we did this all in cash. And then once we got it stabilized, we got a renter in there. We did a cash out refinance. So it wasn't a perfect BRRRR. You know, some of you guys might be familiar with the BRRRR method, or if not, I've got a video on that. But essentially, we're able to take a decent amount of our cash back out to go invest in the next deal. So that was our first deal, and the part that scared me the most was the piece after the purchase. I had never done a big rehab. I'd never done any rehab, and so I didn't even know like anything about contracting really or what needed to be done. I had a basic idea of what we wanted to have done to the property, but I didn't know how to find a contractor, what I should be paying, how the whole draw process works, all that kind of stuff. And so that was kind of a mess, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But I do want to go back to the point that you made in the last video that you are a business owner, even though you have a full-time job, you're a W-2 employee, but you're a business owner and you bought your first business. And then what did you end up doing? You ended up buying a second business.
Right.
Right. So that kind of back to my point of you can't kind of stop at one. Once you do one, like you can tell me, you know, after you bought your first one, it's like you kind of know all the moving pieces there. So the
Yeah.
second one, you know how to do your due diligence, you know how to finance it, you know, kind of like just everything you need to know operationally. Like tell me about that experience going, you know, your first deal and then your second purchase.
Yeah, I think going back to exactly what you were saying about your first house purchase or rental purchases, the first deal is scary. Like there's so much that you don't know, and it's really hard to make that jump without knowing if you're going to land on your feet, especially when there's a lot of work that needed to happen to get it ready to be rented or refinanced. You know, you put a lot of cash into the deal. So on ours, it wasn't as much of a it wasn't an opportunity where we needed to, you know, fix up the property. It was really ready to go. The salon space was really ready to go. It was a beautiful space. So there wasn't any big project that needed to take place. It was more of just managing it and taking care of it going forward so that the tenants are happy and we can continue to rent the space when it's needed. So I think that was definitely the hardest part, was just taking the leap and being like, you know what, I'm going to do the best I can. And if, you know, it doesn't work out, that's okay. I'm going to learn a lot. And that's the biggest step for me so far in this journey has been, I just got to learn. And if I don't know how to do it, I got to either find someone who knows how to do it or, you know, get my hands and feet dirty and get in there and do it myself. So that's the big thing. And then when we got to the second deal, it was a lot easier to pull the trigger. It wasn't nearly as scary, and I definitely think it's gonna continue to be something I want to do for the rest of my life, is continue to grow, either buying businesses or hopefully more into the rental space.
Mm-hmm. So going from that first to the second deal, what do you think, besides, you know, you took the leap, you did get your first deal under your belt. What was like one of the big takeaways that made the second deal so much easier?
I
Was it
think
like financing or you know,
yeah,
I don't know what else is involved in buying a business.
yeah. I think the financing part was a little easier to be like, okay, this makes sense. Let's do it. Um, Being that, you know, this all happened right before COVID, a lot of the projections that we had, it didn't line up exactly with what ended up happening or is happening. But I think that's a, you know, once in 100 years situation that we've kind of stumbled into this year. So it's definitely, I think the experience from the first deal made the second deal a lot faster of a process, and ultimately just, you know, trusting the numbers that we had. so that we could move forward.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, for me, I think the biggest lesson I learned with our first property was vetting the contractor.
Mhm.
Um, didn't really know how to do that. I always trust people I like and trust, and so I'm a big proponent of asking for referrals. And
Mhm.
so I did ask for referrals and ended up meeting a guy through a client of mine that I had and liked, and actually met this contractor with them because they were going to do some work on a property they were going to buy. Really
Mhm.
liked him. He came and saw it, kind of told us what it would be, all this kind of stuff. So we had a pretty good comfort level with him, and we did.
Mhm.
I did get bids from other contractors too. Just like they were just either too high or there was something that seemed off about them, so I didn't want to go with them. So we ended up going with
Mhm.
this guy, uh, but it ended up being a huge mistake in the end because uh, he was a great guy, and um, he was just a bad business person. And
Mhm.
so he was very unorganized, which a lot of contractors are. They're usually good at what they do,
Mhm.
but then there are a lot of other details that they just kind of can't manage as well.
Right.
And so since he was kind of like a one-stop shop, he had a small crew where he'd bring in some subs,
Mhm.
um, kind of rested with him. And so it ended up being like, oh, hey, I need more money for this. We need, to do this. And then we went over
Mhm.
budget on this. And that's kind of stuff is going to happen, but that stuff needs to be like figured out ahead of time. Like, okay,
Right.
this is when you're going to get paid. This is
Mhm.
how you're going to get paid. And we're going to, have a scope of work. And when this amount of work is done and inspected, then you get your draw. And I typically like if it's a big project, I like doing maybe 3 to 5 draws, something like that, and have that in writing with your contractor ahead of time,
Yeah.
because we did not have anything in writing. Essentially, we were just trusting that he would get stuff done. But I would drive by the property and there would be like no one there, like no one was working on it. I'd be
Yeah.
like, what? What's going on?
Yeah.
So I did a bad job of managing the contractor in
Mhm.
that sense, because they ended up going actually not too much over budget, but way over timeline. And that hurt us a
Yeah.
lot because we bought this property in April and we wanted to have it done no later than August so that we could still have a decent tenant pool to pull
Yeah.
from. But I
Mhm.
don't think we got a tenant in there. I don't think they were done until maybe late September, and then we didn't get a renter until November. So we had a couple extra months there of holding costs and of not making
Yeah.
money on rent.
Mhm.
And so that hurt us quite a bit. So, and we'll go into more depth about vetting contractors in another conversation, but that was the
Right.
one big thing I learned, and that was the one big thing I was scared of. So I think sometimes your biggest fear is where you're going to learn the most when you do pull the trigger on a deal.
Yeah.
So for some people, it might be the financing aspect, and maybe they're
Mhm.
just super concerned that they don't know how it works or anything
Yeah.
like that. Well, you can do research up front for sure, especially when it comes more to like financing.
Mhm.
Um, but until you are actually in the thick of it and you see everything, that's when you really, and when it's your own money, that's when it really kind of hits home and
Mhm.
it makes sense. It's not like some abstract thing at that point. It's like I have to write a check for $4,000 to cover
Right.
closing costs or whatever it might be. So,
Yeah.
yeah, whatever your biggest fear might be, that could be where you're going to learn the most. And then once you get over that big fear, then it's just not there the next time around because you already
Yeah.
know how to deal with it. You've already kind of done that. So that kind of leads me to my next question for you is like, you haven't invested in real estate yet.
Mhm.
What do you think are maybe one or two of your big sticking points, either that you're afraid of or just like not even afraid of, but what has held you back to this point, I guess?
That's a great question. I think the biggest thing for me right now is like, how do I know this is a good deal? How do I know I have the skills to, take it down? Take because there's a process that's involved in buying a house. In my experience from looking things up, and what does it take from me to do that? So I don't have my realtor's license. I haven't taken the test. I haven't studied for the test or anything like that. So I feel like that might have been something that could have helped you in this transaction part. Is there's a lot of documentation that happens in purchasing a home, and so that kind of scares me right now. Is like, okay, well, what happens if I find out there's an issue with the house and I need to back out? Like, do I lose my security deposit? What do I do? How do I get out of this if it does turn bad? Because investors are typically looking for distressed properties. So the ones that I've looked at in my area that have those issues, it's like, well, what happens if it goes wrong? So I think that's definitely a big part that I'm scared of right now. Is like, okay, what do I do if things go wrong? Because, like you said, things are going to go wrong. So how do we be prepared for that so that we don't there's less of a burden financially put on that.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
mhm,
for sure. That's definitely a big question for a lot of people, even just your
mhm,
typical home buyers. They kind of want to understand like what happens if the deal goes sideways. So
mhm,
luckily in most real estate contracts, I would say probably all real estate contracts for every
mhm,
state or MLS board, there's going to be a paragraph in there that talks about basically your due diligence period, or they might call it the home inspection period.
mhm,
Typically, it's going to be like 5 business days, and it's going to
mhm,
be right after your contract's accepted. So after your contract is accepted, the sellers have signed it, you've signed it, you submit your earnest money.
mhm,
Um, you have basically 5 business days to do an inspection and then request for any fixes, repairs, credits, things like that. Now a
mhm.
lot of times what happens is it gets a little more drawn out. So usually then there's an addendum or an attorney letter that goes out like, look, we need an extra 3 days here because we haven't gotten the inspection report back, or we don't have a bid yet on, you know, this aspect of the house that could
Yeah.
be at risk here. So there's that
Mhm,
kind of protection period there. Another thing I would maybe mention, it depends on your state. I know in Wisconsin, at least in our area, there's not as much emphasis on using attorneys in the transaction.
mhm,
The realtors pretty much just the realtors and the title companies take care of everything. But
mhm,
back in Illinois, when I was um, doing business there, attorneys were involved in the transactions, at least in the Chicago area. So it was
mhm.
nice to just be able to like you kind of lean on your attorney, and they take care of everything. They know exactly how the time periods,
Mhm.
check out. The letters are going back and forth between the attorneys. So it's kind of nice to lean on them. So in this case, if it was in Wisconsin where you are buying, then you just need to lean heavy on your realtor, make sure that they have experience.
Yeah.
Or you could get an attorney too. I mean, it's an extra cost, might be like
Right.
$500, something like that. But maybe that gives you a little extra peace of mind to have them at least at with your first deal. You could go
Yeah.
that route, and it might give you a little extra peace of mind because then they're kind of double checking some of the realtors work and the title company's work, stuff like that.
Got it. Okay. So you would recommend as your first deal to consider it an attorney, or I guess if it's something that you're scared of, that's
For
something you
for
could look
me,
at.
for the $500, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars,
Yeah.
or even if it was just your earnest money, let's just say you put down, you know, 3, 4, $5,000 as earnest
Mhm,
money on a deal, $500 to mitigate against that. I mean, might be worth it, or it might just be
mhm.
worth it to have that contact as well. If you like working with them, they seem sharp. They could come in really handy down the line when you have like a zoning issue or you want to buy another property that's a little more complex, something like
Right.
that. So it's a good way to add to your network
Mhm.
as well. One quick tip with attorneys: just make sure that it's a fixed fee, that it's not an hourly fee. You want to know that if it's an hourly fee, don't use them. And just go for the fixed fee. That's probably going to be around $500 for a real estate transaction. In most places, it might be a little less or a little bit more. Um, but for me, if I'm buying a property anywhere, I want an attorney involved. I don't care if the realtor says we don't need him. I still want one involved just because I don't necessarily know the local rules and regulations, and I don't know
Right.
how adept the realtor is. I mean, realtors have been known to miss things or miss deadlines and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
it's just someone that's kind of double checking the work, and it is a lot of paperwork in a real estate transaction. So
Sure.
something could be missed along the line. So
Mhm.
that could give you a little bit of peace of mind to go after that first deal. But to as far as like that protection period, if everything gets agreed to,
Mhm.
let's just call it that first 5 days. Let's just say there was one thing, one electrical issue that was like a $500 thing that they needed to take care of, in the breaker
Mhm.
box. They get a licensed contractor, they take care of it, they have the invoice. At that point, if you accept it, then you're good to go and you're going to move forward in the transaction. And at
Sure.
that point, it's really on you. If you have a financing contingency,
Mhm.
you have to say that, hey, look, I'm going to buy this, and this is what our that's why you have like a pre-approval letter up front too,
Right.
saying that I am willing and able to buy this. So if you mess up on that side, then at that point you could have to forfeit earnest money.
Okay.
Um, but you do have that initial protection if the house has like a foundation issue or something like that, that a home
Mhm.
inspector points out, maybe even bring in a second opinion, like a structural engineer or something like that.
Mhm.
Because some foundation issues can be fixed, and it's not a big
Right.
deal. And actually, you might be able to get a better deal because of it. Um,
Mhm.
so those are kind of, you do have some built-in protections. You just have to be aware of what the timelines are.
Sure. So, for example, there is a foundation issue, and I want to back out of the deal. It's too big. It's going to wreck it for me. It doesn't make sense anymore. Do you get your earnest money back at that point?
Yes.
That you walked away.
Yeah. If you cancel the contract, you're still within that time frame.
Period.
Yeah, you can say that, what it didn't essentially literally pass inspection according
Right.
to what we're looking for. You could try to negotiate, but if it's a severe problem, if it's like a $30,000 foundation fix, I mean, you
Hmm.
could ask for that. But do you want to go through the headache of having to
Yeah.
get that fixed or get a credit, and then you have to take care of it on the back end? And what happens then if it goes over budget? It ends up being a $50,000 fix. Like, so
Yeah.
things to consider. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Cool. No, that's helpful to know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's, like you said, there are a million pieces of a transaction. Luckily, we're
Hmm.
going to be talking a lot about a lot of those pieces individually, and just kind
Yeah.
of what makes up like your team. Because we talked a lot about that a little bit last time too.
Hmm.
You could have a team locally or somewhere else where you're buying a property. It takes, by my count off the top of my head, at least a dozen people, if not more, to make a real estate transaction go down.
Hmm.
Um, and when it comes down to it, the big things you need to be worried about are, how are you paying for it?
Hmm.
How, um, how are you analyzing the deal? What are your criteria?
Sure.
And then how are you going to manage the property once you do own it?
Hmm.
Those are your responsibility initially. And some of those you can pass off eventually,
Hmm.
especially the management side. But those are things you need to worry about once, because everyone else has a job to do. Your realtor has a job to do, your attorney has a job to do, your home inspector has a job to
Right.
do, the title company has their job. So um, just think about it that way, where it is, no one can just take down a real estate deal all by themselves. I suppose
Yeah.
maybe if you're an attorney that knows how to also do like a home inspection, like you could do it all yourself
Right.
theoretically, and you were paying cash. But most people, it takes a dozen people, it takes a decent sized team to take down even just one little deal.
Sure. So yeah, I think that's the other thing is, what are so I talked about alluded to it a little bit last time. I think I'm looking in too many places and not niche down or focused on an area with a team in place or working on getting a team in place. So um, you mentioned it is like, what are your criteria? So when you started out, what did you say was a good deal? Like, I'm going to go forward if I see this, and this.
Yeah, I think we're looking for, you know, maybe you've heard about the 1% rule or the 2% rule, where essentially,
Hmm.
uh, your all in cost, you're getting, you know, 1% of the value in rents.
Hmm.
So, if it's $150,000 place like ours appraised for, are we getting 1,500 a month? Yeah, actually, right now we're right at like 1,600, but we were only in for, what was it,
Four.
122,000,
Yeah.
yeah, or 124 or something like that. So let's just call it 125,000, and so we had that $25,000 equity piece, which is nice to have because
Right.
that's essentially covering most of our down payment
Hmm.
on the property. And then we were able to, I think right out of the gate, we're getting like 1475 or around there in rent, and now we're a little over 1600. So um, yeah, figure out what your cash flow rule is. For me, it could be like the 1% or 2% rule for some people, or it could just be per door. Like I want a cash flow after all expenses, like everything, not just your PITI. You want,
Hmm.
$100 per door or something like that. I think that's a decent rule of thumb. Um, and
Hmm.
we can get into like expenses stuff like capex and stuff like that later, because those are a lot of things that investors make mistakes on. For sure. And they're like, oh, I'm cash flowing, $600 a month. It's like, well, yeah, if you're just looking at your PITI, which is your mortgage, your insurance, your taxes. Um, so yeah, the PI is the principal and interest. But then there's other things like vacancy
Right.
and maintenance. And then the
Hmm.
big expenditures are the capital expenditures. So if you need a new roof or all new windows or stuff
Right.
like that does come from your pocket. So how are
Yeah.
you accounting for that? It's not like all of a sudden the rent went up $5,000 one month and you're able to pay for a new roof. You either have to be setting aside money or just it has to be worked into your numbers. So you have to have like kind of percentages in mind
Mhm.
of what this is going to cost over time, because that is a real cost.
Sure. Okay.
Yep.
Um, I think well, I do have one more thing that
Yeah.
has been another issue is I think for everyone starting out, it feels like that financing is really a big issue. Like, do you have enough capital for the down payment? Where are you going to get funding? Should you be working with a private money lender? How did you guys kind of make that decision? Determine when it was right to go into it? Did you keep a reserve on the side in case things did go south? How did you set that up?
Yeah, so we had a relationship with a commercial lender, and
Mhm.
we didn't have enough cash really to, because we kind of wanted to do that burst strategy. So we wanted to buy properties in cash, and then force some appreciation, get them
Mhm.
stabilized, and then do a cash out refinance so we could use our
Mhm.
funds again. It's a great strategy when it works. It doesn't always work perfectly. It depends on where you're investing as well.
Mhm.
So we essentially we put up cash. They gave us a line of credit with a small multiplier. So it's like essentially we had $150,000 to play with.
Okay.
So we did have that much, and that enabled us to get that property. And then we
Mhm.
still had some reserves on the side as well.
Okay.
I think I think like you alluded to like a private money lender, or some people are interested in like a hard money lender. I wouldn't go for that on my first deal. Get some experience first. Do a
Yeah.
couple deals before you start venturing into some more creative financing methods.
Sure.
I think you learn a lot more. First of all, when it's your own money.
Right.
Second of all, it gets a little more complex once you start adding those extra pieces. Not impossible, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it because that, especially hard money lenders, it gets a little stickier. Um,
Mhm.
and a lot of times, hard money just doesn't work out as well for rentals. You're going to have to stabilize the property pretty quickly. So sometimes it makes sense for flips. I've used hard money on flips, but
Mhm.
again, we'll talk about that a little more later. But yeah, I think the biggest mistake a lot of people make, yeah, is probably those two things. Is they go after something like hard money right out of the gate
Yeah.
because they don't have enough money saved up or something like that. That's a
Mhm.
recipe for disaster. Because if you don't have money saved up, you don't have some sort of cushion. Um, and then you're going after this high interest rate money, that can be a big problem, especially because
Yeah.
some hard money lenders are ruthless. So you just have to be careful with that. You're just going to learn more when you're invested. I mean, you are invested, and
Yeah.
then I think the second mistake is probably, yeah, not having enough in reserves, because look at what happened this year with COVID. It's like
Mhm.
some people are not paying rent. But guess what? The landlords, unless they own the property outright, they're still on the hook for the mortgage. There are
Yeah.
some forgiveness programs and stuff like that, but eventually this stuff is going to come due. We're all on the
Yeah.
hook for what we owe. So make
Yeah.
sure that you have reserves, or that you're setting aside reserves from day one, just in case something goes wrong. Like, you have a long-term vacancy, or the tenant trashes the place, or you have an eviction, or you need to unexpectedly fix something that really didn't seem like it was going to, like if you have a brand new furnace and all of a sudden it blows up and it wasn't under
Hmm.
warranty for some reason and you have to buy a new furnace, like things
Yeah.
will pop up. So definitely, yeah, have reserves as well.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. So yeah, but I think you're ready. I think it's more like what we talked about last time. It's just probably focusing in on that area that you want to invest in.
Yeah.
And then we'll get more into, so that we'll talk a little bit about demographics, what makes a good area, and then putting
Hmm.
together that team and stuff like that.
Yeah. That sounds great. One more question off
Yeah.
that. So with everything going on with COVID, like you said, mortgages are still due, but rent not isn't necessarily being collected. Do you think people should be investing right now, or they should be holding off? Or are you investing right now, or are you waiting?
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I'm kind of in a holding pattern,
Mhm.
for a couple of reasons. One, not a ton of funds to put into a deal. We
Mhm.
did buy one in February, so it's kind of like a little tapped out at the moment, and kind of just
Mhm.
seeing what's happening with our properties. Like, are tenants paying? Are we having higher vacancy? Are we having some non-payment issues? Can we handle that type of stuff? So trying to make sure that we get through some of that stuff. That being said, if a great deal came across my desk today, I would certainly look into it.
Yeah.
We had a deal brought to us a week ago or so, and we're looking into it
Mhm.
because it looks decent. It's just like could we come up with funding somehow? Um,
Mhm.
so I think, but I do think looking a little farther in the future, once things kind of stabilize, maybe if there's a vaccine and things like that, and more people are getting back to work, I think real estate lags the general market by quite a bit because it's a slow moving thing. So
Mhm.
I think any type of opportunity for, say, distressed properties in the more volume, like what we saw in like post the last Great Recession, um, it's going to take another year or two because in some states it takes over a year just to process one foreclosure.
Yeah.
So, if someone is right now, like let's just say they've been out of work for 6 months now, and now the bank is starting the foreclosure process, it could be another 12 to 13 months, again, depending
Mhm.
on the state, that they actually have to move out and the house is foreclosed upon. Then it's up to the bank, and the banks are notoriously slow to dispose of the property. So it might
Yeah.
take another 2, 3, 6 months for them to line everything up to get the property on the market to sell it.
Mhm.
So they're not very good on that side. So it takes some time. So it really
Mhm.
could be up to 2 years before you start seeing people that are getting in trouble now, where there's going to be more opportunity to snatch up stuff like that. That being said, though, you can always find a good deal. You can find a distressed property. You just have to get creative
Mhm.
with tactics. Um, and so for someone that's just starting out, I wouldn't be like crazy excited to like buy something today
Mhm.
unless it was a screaming deal.
Yeah.
But if you have those other pieces in place, like you know how to analyze the deal, you know what your cash flow is, and you have those reserves,
Yeah.
like just mitigate that downside. If you plan for the worst case scenario, you're going to be fine.
Right.
So if you're like, okay, there's maybe I don't get rent for a year, like that's a pretty bad downside. But if you have those reserves set aside, or you could find another use for the property or whatever it might be, then
Mhm.
you're going to be okay. But I think there'll be more opportunity a little bit later because right now it's such a tough market, especially here. I mean, other markets
Mhm.
too, but here it's crazy. So we are starting to see some more listings, I think, but
Mhm.
um, it's just a very tough, competitive, and more expensive market as well.
Yeah. Agree.
So, but we'll definitely dive into some more stuff later. So yeah, that's it for this week, guys. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you in the next one.